Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today to celebrate Professor Julia Murray's new book, The Aura of Confucius, Relics and Representations of the Sage at the Kongzhai Shrine in Shanghai, which is published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. My name is Yuhang Li, and I'm the Associate Professor in Chinese Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today's event is co-organized by the Art History Department and the Center for East Asian Studies. I'm very honored to host today's book launch event and to introduce our two distinguished scholars. So first, I would like to explain the program of today's event. So after my introduction, Professor Murray will give a short presentation on her book. And then Professor Robson will make remarks and have conversations with Professor Murray on her book. Then we will open the floors to the audience for questions. So we encourage people to ask questions on your own, since this will carry on the conversation better. So you can use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which is, and then we will call your name and unmute you. Yeah. So first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. And Professor Murray is Professor Emerita of Art History, East Asian Studies, and Religious Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's extremely prolific scholar. And if I mentioned all of her achievements and publications, I fear that there would be little time left for her talk, let alone discussion. So I will just mention a few of her publications. So she is the author of Ma He Zhi and the illustrations of the books of oaths, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1993. And her second book, Mirrors of Morality, Chinese Narrative Illustrations and the Confucian Ideology, which was published by University of Hawaii Press in 2007. This book was also translated into Chinese and was published by Beijing Sanlian Shudian in 2014. She has also published many articles on Chinese painting, woodblock printing, narrative illustrations, and pictorial biography. Her current work depends on her long-standing interest in Confucius icon and Confucianism, Confucian ideology, and how this ideology is materialized and takes on different visual forms. So she recovers the history of monument that appears to be deliberately lost and offers us a valuable window onto the religious dimension of Confucianism. Consequently, in addition to art history, she makes an important contribution to the study of Chinese religion. So this study of the religious dimension of materializing Confucianism allows her to illuminate the complex interactions among different religious traditions in China. So the significance of relics, the function of rituals and sites. So we all look forward an extremely thought-provoking and exciting event today. So I will move on to introduce our next speaker. Professor James Robson is James Cleric and Yulin Law, Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the Harvard University. He specialized in the history of medieval Chinese Buddhism and Taoism, and is particularly interested in issues of sacred geography, local religious history, talismans, and Chan or Zen Buddhism. So he's the author of Power of Place, the religious landscape of the Southern Sacred Peak Nanyue in medieval China, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2009. So this book was awarded two very important book prize, including the Toshihide Numata Book Prize in Buddhism in 2010. Professor Robson is also the author of many important articles, for instance, Science of Power, Talismanic Writing in Chinese Buddhism, and also Faith in Buddhism's on the confluence of museums and religious sites in Asia. So his current research, I believe, includes like two long project. So one is on the history of the confluence of Buddhist monasteries and mental hospitals in Japan, and then second current book project on the Chinese icons, especially I think many of you have heard his wonderful discussion on this second book project on the Chinese cultic image and their content recently at IFA. So I believe this book project will reshape our understanding of Chinese religious icons from many perspectives. So we're really fortunate today to witness a dialogue between these two prominent scholars. And both of their works are related to local history, religion, and material practice, but yet from like a different perspective. So without any further ado, I invite Professor Julia Murray to take the virtual stage.
Thank you. I need to share my screen. Is my screen sharing now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yu Hong. I greatly appreciate your overly kind introduction, and thank you, James, for taking the time out of a busy point in the semester to join us. And I also wish to thank my former colleagues at the Department of Art History and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin. So as my first slide here shows, this is a book about Confucius, images of Confucius, and most specifically, a unique shrine called Kongzhai, or Kung Residence, on the outskirts of modern Shanghai, a place Confucius himself never went. And it is premised on the idea that a 34th generation descendant buried his robe and cap in the early 7th century at this place. And then another 1,000 years later, a shrine complex with a temple, sacrificial hall, a tomb of the robe and cap with commemorative markers and lots of other shrine-related buildings developed. So the point is to offer some new insights on religious dimensions of Confucianism by bringing in the visual and material elements that help to make this place, Kongzhai, a convincing site for scholar pilgrims and significant place to experience the aura, as I like to call it, the lingering spirit of Confucius that perhaps floated around his buried clothing. Now, just as a brief introduction to the place, Kongzhai is, well, first of all, here's China, Shanghai. Kongzhai is on the very edge of modern Shanghai. It was not always part of Shanghai, but it was originally part of Jiangsu province and specifically Songjiang prefecture, but now is literally on the periphery of Shanghai. Confucius lived his whole life in North China, outlined here by this box, and his hometown known as the state of Lu in his day, modern day Chufu. So you can see it's quite a long way between these two places. And as I say, he never went there. And the story goes that later descendants in fleeing troubles in the north moved to the south, and one of them brought the clothing and personal jade ornaments of Confucius and buried them. Well, how did I get into this topic? I just want to say a few things about that, just to maybe provide a little bit of entertainment. I used to be a museum curator, and I worked at the Harvard Art Museums in the 1980s. And we got a very large donation of Chinese and Japanese printed books, a lot of them rare items. And one of them was A Life of Confucius in very large woodblock printed pictures with a gorgeous brocade cover. And I had so much else to do, I couldn't pay a lot of attention to it then, but it really stuck with me in the back of my mind. And when I became an academic and moved to the University of Wisconsin, I started looking into other examples of the illustrated life of Confucius. And I found that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different versions of serial pictures illustrating from pre-conception to long after death, the life of Confucius and the early years of the cult of Confucius that developed in China. So of course, in the early 1990s, I had to go to Chufu, the hometown of Confucius, and see the great first temple, where there was great sacrificial hall, many other buildings. These are given imperial yellow tiled roofs because they were patronized by, the cult was patronized by emperors of the dynasties of China. But of particular interest to me was a building at the very far back. It's not even in the slide. As a matter of fact, it's behind this building, called the Hall of the Sage's Traces. And inside are 120 stone tablets, of which 112 are carved with scenes from the life of Confucius, one of the largest expansions of the treatment of that subject ever. Many of the previous versions that I'd studied only had 40 pictures or even 29. So this was indeed very important. I also went to Japan to look for examples. There are lots of lives of Confucius in print and painting and even in rubbings. And when I was there, I met a Japanese scholar who showed me what I thought was simply a list of the original events in the life of Confucius that was, as it turned out, in this book called the Gazetteer of Kungjai, basically a collection of historical documents and related information about a place that I had never heard of, Kongzhai. So I went to find the book itself and discovered that at the beginning, the very first pages were small-scale replicas of calligraphy that the Kangxi emperor, one of the great emperors of the last dynasty, had bequeathed to Kongzhai when he passed by in 1705 on his 5th southern tour. So then I was really quite intrigued and wanted to know more. Another thing in that book, that Gazetteer of Kungjai, was a site plan, which along the edge it says that it's just a prospective plan. Some of the buildings may have been there already, some were only in the planning. I dare say this Tower of Imperial Calligraphy for the emperor's calligraphy to be stored was not yet in existence when this plan was drawn, but this showed the ambition of developing a place to honor the relics of Confucius and their recognition by the Emperor of China. I then discovered in further research, I was sort of getting more and more drawn into this topic, that there was an earlier edition of this Gazetteer of Kungjai And it showed an earlier stage of development. I've labeled again a couple of the main things. So the most significant element is this tomb of the robe and cap. Over here, there's a separate picture in that book that shows the tablet with a large inscription saying exactly that, the tomb of the robe and cap of sage Confucius. This is just a diagram of a very simple diagram and some information about people who sponsored it in the early 17th century. In the early 17th century, that was a time when there were lots of kind of literary societies and academies of people who were disenchanted with politics. So they were withdrawing to compose poetry and study ancient ritual and so forth. And I think that the development of Kungjai in the early 17th century reflects that larger social and political movement. I then was looking around to find administrative gazetteers, local gazetteers for the region, and to see if Kongzhai was treated in them. And I did find, indeed, both the county, Qingpu County, which was created in the late 16th century, and the prefecture, Songjiang, compilations included entries on Kongzhai, and they used site plans to represent it. And the most recent one was from the continuation of the County Gazetteer, which finally came out in 1934, although it was compiled right after the fall of the Qing dynasty. And it shows a rather more modest place. But even that modest place was demolished in the Cultural Revolution. These are pictures from Chufu, which also suffered grievous damage at that time. But Kungjai was destroyed as well. And I don't have any pictures of Red Guards at Kongzhai, but in any case, the Red Guards and Mao Zedong at that time repudiated feudal elements such as Confucius and everything connected with him. But I wanted to go see what might still be on the site. So finally, in 2001, I was able to go, and I was fortunate to have some introductions from a great archaeologist and native of Qingpu named Huang Pei. And so I was able to not only go to the site, but also to meet a couple of local descendants and see the few things that had been salvaged after the destruction, which included a couple of stone tablets that were being just kept on the ground at a pagoda in town. They include a carved portrait of Confucius. I was also given, at the time, very blurry old photographs. These are actually much better quality ones that the current director of the Qingpu Museum generously shared with me. But I first began to see old photographs in 2001. So I had more of a sense of what the place had looked like in real life. This was the very striking building for the imperial calligraphy. And unfortunately, the photo of the main hall doesn't show how the calligraphy was copied onto wooden tablets and carved to display beside the altar. And you can't even see the sculptural icon that was there as well. This was the entrance if you came by boat, which most people did. And there was a grand arch that proclaimed that this place was a little Cheli, which is a reference to Chufu. So in other words, saying it's a microcosm of this primordial site associated with Confucius. I also was allowed to look at an album of photographs identified as historical remains in the Cultural Relics Bureau in Shanghai, again, thanks to Huang Pei. And this is before the destruction, obviously, but it shows that even before being totally demolished, that agricultural activities, and here we have some hay covering the Kangxi Emperor's calligraphy, had kind of taken over the place. And in fact, it seems that the reason for paying attention to it at that time was because there was a report that peasants had knocked down the clay sculptures and made the main hall into a pigsty. Well, as I say, I first went in August of 2001, and this view from Google satellite just a little bit after that shows from the air that there was still a little village on the site. None of the shrine buildings still stood there, but it was still a place that there were people named Kung. And later on, because the development of the industrial zone, Qingpu was regarded as a prime territory for that. Everything was knocked down, leaving only 2 ginkgo trees. So these are right after the knocking, not immediately after, but pretty close to after the village was removed. And then here, much more recently, you can see the encroachment of the industrial park, leaving just 2 very tall ginkgo trees, and surrounded by just a perimeter of fields, which it seems are not being developed as kind of a buffer zone. And that's because the trees are protected as first-class old trees. And as a matter of fact, this is the first plaque that marks that. It says they were 450 years old. I think it was just a guess. And then some subsequent plaques. Interestingly, Kungjai had been listed as a county level protection relic in the late 50s. It was abolished as such in 1964. And then, as I say, the Red Guards destroyed it in 66. And in 86, it was definitively not relisted, but the trees were listed. And this most recent plaque here, which repeats all the information of the earlier one, just changes the date and claims that the trees were designated in 86. So I think quite clearly they're surrogates for the larger Kongzhai complex. Anyway, so that's kind of background on how I got into all this. So I was very keen to reconstruct what had happened to this place, how had it become important, and what were the reasons for destroying it. People told me that that was too narrow a focus and that I should broaden it out. And I thought, wow, how can that be such a narrow focus? I have to look at all sorts of things. So even genealogies of the Kungs, and there was a great genealogy published in 2009 that extends to 80 volumes. In any case, I took that criticism to heart, and in organizing my book, I decided that I needed to address the relationship between Chufu and Kungjai, as well as the details of Kungjai's own history, and examine the role of visual and material elements in creating the resonance of the place for people to come into contact with the spirit of Confucius. So first, Chufu, again, the main sacrificial hall, the building with the pictorial biography, but also other elements such as the iconic large-size sculptures that are inside of this sacrificial hall. And offerings were made directly to those sculptural representations. And there are many incised and painted portraits of Confucius, some of them in this building, the Hall of the Sage's Traces. Lots of imperial calligraphy as emperors honored Confucius with phrases from the Confucian classics, such as we see on some of these archways. But also Chufu is important because it has the family ancestral cult of the Kung descendants. This is a shot of the family shrine, which is not part of the main complex for official sacrifice. by contrast with other temples of the state cult of Confucius, only family-related temples were supposedly allowed to have representational images after 1530. Everywhere else could only have inscribed tablets, so the name and posthumous title, Confucius here, and various disciples surrounding. So there's a great distinction to be made between family cult and state cult. Relics came to seem very important because the early myth about, or I shouldn't say myth, I should say the story about the burial of the robe and cap of Confucius immediately evokes the beginning of the imperial sacrifices to Confucius when the first emperor of the Han dynasty went to Chufu and supposedly sacrificed in the presence of personal items belonging to Confucius. And you see here very clearly his cap and his robe folded neatly, but also his zither. And over here, it's kind of anachronistic for its format, but a book referring to his editing and writing of works that are regarded as the Confucian classics. And here, one of the pages of the 17th century version of the Gazetteer of Kungjai, a picture of the above ground tomb mound to mark the robe and cap with a tablet saying Tomb of the Robe and Cap. Also, the importance of portraits. So portraits were added to Kongzhai in the 17th century, early 18th century as well, as they turned up, including by miraculous occurrences. The story goes that someone saw some light shining above a marsh and was curious and followed them and discovered there was a tablet carved with a portrait of Confucius. And so it was brought to Kongzhai as an appropriate place to harbor it. But it relates very closely to an example that's in Chufu and also in a temple of a southern branch of the Kung descendants, which was formed after a major invasion in the 12th century. So this southern branch has continued to have its own rituals and observances, and they have all got the same portrait. Pictorial biography, as I mentioned, the great 120 tablets in Chufu, the largest one that I know of, but the earliest version, which was what I was looking for back in the 1990s, only has 30 scenes. And it happened that the great-grandson of the person who compiled it served at Songjiang, and the project to recreate this original version got started, and it went through many iterations, but finally was created by the beginning of the Qing dynasty by 1682. But at the same time, a local magistrate who had grander ambitions decided that he wanted a fancier one. So we ended up with two versions being finished at about the same time. One, a very simple and plain and archaic looking one, reproducing the original from 1444. And this newfangled one with lots of details and modern furniture and careful drawing and so forth, a lot of filler activity, and with totally different texts supposedly composed by this man, Lin Yufang. So that was another aspect that could connect to Chufu, the setting up of pictures of the life of Confucius, so that if you came and performed a sacrifice on the regular occasions, there would be things to walk around and look at afterwards, just as would be the case if you were going to Chufu to offer sacrifice to Confucius. So in the second half of the book, where I try to analyze how this story comes together and how it falls apart in some ways, I consider not just the developments in textual sources, all these different gazetteers that are periodically produced, but also in visual representations of the site as a whole. So here we have the circa 1681, 1707, 1934. And then these two are hand-drawn. And I think that I'm pretty certain, as a matter of fact, that they were made in connection with the campaign of repairing Kungjai in the 1840s. It happened that a descendant of Confucius, one of the Kungs, was sent as a magistrate of Chufu in 1840. And it seems that that activated a connection between Chufu and Qingpu, so that they were able to get support and, more importantly, models to refurbish this shrine at Kongzhai. In the book, I also have a section where I compare the representations in drawn plans, where I would argue that you can have a little bit of freedom to represent things as you wish they were, even if they aren't actually that way, as opposed to photography, which, even though there's a lot of manipulation that one can do with photography, it is more dependent on what is in front of the camera as to what comes out. And I make some comparisons by juxtaposing the 1934 plan with a few of the older of the two sets of photographs. You can certainly see the resemblance, but things are sometimes a little grander in the drawing. In any case, this is the structure of the book, just to go back to that. So here it's kind of a straight up describing life of Confucius, the development of his cults, then a narrative history of Kungjai, which I pieced together from all these different sources and just try to smooth over the inconsistencies, and then a survey of all the visual representations, the different forms, the icons, the portraits, pictorial biography, and even some carved texts. So that's the straight story, so to speak. And then the second part of the book, I take it apart and look at how it was constructed, starting with the first recording of the legends or the story of Kungjai in the late 12th century, which was prompted by the discovery of a tablet, a tomb epitaph in the river close by that used the name Kongzhai, or the resident of Master Kung, and it was dated to the Tang Dynasty, date in the 8th century. Coincidentally, a small collection of jade ornaments was discovered when people were digging an irrigation ditch in that area. So these two things were put together, and it seems that there had been a long-standing local legend about the burial of the clothing of Confucius and ancient residents by people who were his descendants. So this is the start of the story, and it gets elaborated and developed in different ways over the next several centuries until the beginning of the 17th century. And I think that the development of a physical shrine with lots of different kinds of buildings, and coincidentally with that, the recording of history in a more systematic form and embellishing it with lots of poetic inscriptions and encomia of various kinds, records of different people and buildings, and just all kinds of stuff to make it grander and grander. So that's a big expansion of the story. And then just when things look really great, the emperor has recognized it with his calligraphy. This book is finished, then a new emperor comes to the throne and really slams down hard on too much local activism, too much personal interests being pursued, and private histories as opposed to national history and official history. So it seems that this very grandiose Gazetteer of Kungjai was pretty much suppressed, although it didn't disappear entirely, because elements of it do appear in the later Gazetteers and in poetry collections. So people are inspired to write poetry about Kongzhai. And the last occasion that I know of was in 1914, and poems were sent in from all over China because the Confucius Religion Association held a sacrifice at Kongzhai and then sent out a call for people to sort of chime in with poems. So finally, I analyzed the rhetorical construction through these physical plans, the pictorial plans and photographs. And my conclusion isn't terribly conclusive, because I think even though if I published this book 15 years ago, I would have said, absolutely, this place is never going to be rebuilt. I'm not so sure now. There is finally a little bit of attention, it seems, and at least some acceptance that it once existed. But I think that the elements that made it significant are still pretty much at odds with official ideology in China, the notion that no one ever saw this buried clothing, for one thing. Why would it last that long? Why would it be taken by some random descendant and buried in this random place, and so forth and so on? So those things aren't the kinds of stories that I think are officially promoted, but maybe there's some slightly greater acceptance now. People have made efforts to have it recognized, especially the local descendants. There's been discussion on their internet discussion groups sometimes when they visit the site and offer something on the birthday of Confucius particularly. But so far as I know, and I haven't been back to China since 2016, things still haven't developed there. In any case, this is the layout of the book, and I have a timeline so that all of these miscellaneous events kind of fall into place a little easier. Chufu and Kongzhai in the same chart, so you can compare. And well, if you're interested in buying the book, here's where you can get it for a 20% discount. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you. And I suppose I should stop sharing here. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I think I would love to know what James makes of all this, and eagerly looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great.
Yeah, so thank Professor Marie for this, for sharing her experience of doing research in the past several decades. So everyone, yeah, it's a really very nice, beautiful book. So now we invite Professor Robson to make remarks and also to have a dialogue with Professor Marie. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? I hope that's okay, good. Well, first, thanks to Yuhong Li for organizing this event, and also to the Department of Art History and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a really nice opportunity to celebrate the publication of Julia's book. I wasn't sure exactly how she was going to do her presentation. I'm really glad that she was able to walk through it in a kind of a broad sense for everyone, because I imagine most people do not have the book in hand yet. I've only had it for about a week or so. So it was unclear how much content folks signing on today would have, but in any case, that was a very nice synopsis of it. It brings together, as you can tell, literally decades of her work on this topic. And once you do get this book in your hands, you will find it to be a beautiful book. In fact, it has excellent images, and I would just encourage people to also look at the dates of the photos on that book. This is a book published in 2022, but there are photographs from 2020, right during the time of our lockdown, and also appreciate Julia's clever use of Google Earth and screenshots that were taken all the way up until 2021. This is really kind of a cool use of that technology of us being kind of stuck in place, but how to do something. It was very, very nicely done. And I should also say that publishers should take note here that the book includes inline Chinese characters on first usage, which is fantastic, and also in an appealing font, and the useful appendix that she noted here, which is allows one to orient oneself in time, which I found really useful as I was trying to digest all of the rich information that was in the book. So anyway, it's a really wonderfully produced book. As she noted, it's in these two parts, and I thought the two parts worked fabulously together. One kind of just telling the sort of overall narrative of all of this, and then part two gets into the real nitty-gritty analysis and a kind of critical analysis of all the sources and different types of images and things like that, and showing how complicated the earlier history is, or the other history, one might say. And I thought it worked fabulously. So the volume includes some really fascinating textual and visual sleuth work that is done by Julia here. We see her finding lost sources in libraries due to some of them being mislabeled, and also tracking down editions of Gazetteers that are in detail, and leading Julia on a hunt from the Harvard Yenjing Library to Columbia University, and as she noted in her opening comments, to the National Diet Library in Japan. It weaves together local history with wider imperial historical changes, and it takes one through textual and poetic representations, and then through visual images, both of Confucius and of the site itself and its architecture, including the image that she showed, which I found really fascinating, of Shi Yu Ho's 18th century, what I would call aspirational representations, which are plans in a sense for what he thought it might be able to become. And then we also have these really interesting ones of the painted images that she showed that have some even notes on them about what was in disrepair and all of that. Really fascinating documents. So wonderful use of those materials. And we see Julia really operating in a number of different guises here. At once, she's a historian studying text and changing editions of the Difangzhi, or the local gazetteers. I found those sections a really fascinating read, actually, to see how the gazetteers were being supplemented, but also how they were silencing certain information. And I think anybody who works with local sources should read those carefully and look at the transformations over time. We also see her operating in her, I guess, traditional mode as an art historian, studying the portraits and also the pictorial biographies, of which she's written so much about, and I've learned so much from. And as she noted in her opening comments, and I should also say, given that today is Earth Day, I'd be remiss not to note her close and fascinating analysis of trees. And you may think, I mean, in a sense, that's the only thing that survives of the site. So the trees, these ginkgo trees, play an important role here. But it's a very, I think, nuanced and interesting set of thoughts about those trees and their perceived, the way that they were perceived to be manifestations of sacred power. I particularly like the transition in chapter 7, where, and this also came through in her opening comments just now, where we move from the earlier images of the site and also from monochrome images up through painted images, and then into the use of photographic evidence. Most of those photographs, as far as I could tell, were dating from either the 1930s, and then, or more generally, the early 20th century, and then the ones from the set from 1957. And these were really fascinating, I think, a way in which she could compare the earlier gazetteer images and other images to what was captured in those photographs. So I have to say, I found it rather poignant to look at some of these look at the old illustrations, and then also these not so old photographs alongside contemporary images, to see just what has been lost and the destruction of the natural state of that site as well. And this is just, of course, one story among thousands of others of the loss of pre-modern patrimony and the destruction of sites, sacred or otherwise, throughout China. So in a sense, this book is an important way of preservation of what we know about this site and a visual record of what's there. So I think everyone who picks up this book will find something different of interest in it. It's an incredibly rich book. What I found most striking about this work, however, is that this is a study of a failed sacred site. It is and this I don't mean this in a derogatory sense. I think this is one of the most fascinating things about this. We know, I think I saw Suna Kan had signed on. We know from the book that she did with Yu Fang on pilgrimages and sacred sites, a very important earlier book, that those were about these successful sites of how a sacred site becomes a pilgrimage location and persists over time. And here we have an interesting case then of a failed site, a site that did not follow other trajectories of the revival of sacred sites either. It no longer exists, or it had its buildings moved elsewhere or repurposed. And we even, reading the overall history of this site, we also find that it had a hard time. It was a site that was struggling throughout its entire existence to maintain itself, and then going through periods of short periods of real success and flourishing, and then dragged back down and falling into disrepair. And we see this cycle repeat itself in the story that Julia tells in this book. In short, there is a kind of profanation of the site over time where the materials are destroyed or repurposed. And ultimately, with the final destruction in 1966, never to be revived. And I was really glad that she also included another failed attempt to try to institute a place of veneration of Confucius. And that, of course, was the image that was erected in Tiananmen Square in January of 2011, I believe, which was then unceremoniously removed just a couple of months later and put in the, I think, in the National Museum of China, something like that. But I was glad you brought that in, because it's also just shows the kind of contentious issues surrounding Confucius and veneration and cult and what was going on and why that was taken down so quickly. So in this case, we have a site that developed and then went through these ebbs and flows of varying degrees of activity. And it was all based on this claim, as Julia noted in her opening comments, about the possession of the robe and cap of Confucius, which was actually never seen by anyone. Never seen by anyone, except for one. I guess there was one lone voice from the 19th or 20th century of somebody who claimed to have seen it, but there seems to be no corroboration of that. It's just somebody claimed it. That being said, I think what we have here is a situation very much like what Levi-Strauss called when he wrote about how myths and folklore can work like something that is a virtual image that casts a real shadow. In other words, it didn't matter that these relics were never seen. They became real and cast a real history over time. And as we know from the work on Christian relics from people like Patrick Geary and others, that relics are meaningless unto themselves. In fact, what they are didn't matter so much as the way that they're framed. And so what Julia, even though she doesn't get into the kind of reflecting much on other studies of relics and things, it really shows, she shows how in this case, it was the framing of those relics through narrative, through visual imagery that packaged them, and also the practices that were associated with them. So the site, in fact, becomes, or the site, and I would say all of these different elements that are associated with it, and that she describes in such detail, itself becomes like the reliquary for the site in terms of presenting and the ever absent relics that are claimed to be there. And then it's the book is filled with all kinds of interesting references to miracle stories that obviously this is what you need for relics to be successful, or is some kind of miraculous tales about things there in order to draw attention and also to legitimate them. We need some way to authenticate them, and those miracle stories are working in that way. One thing it reminded me of for those in Buddhist studies was the work that Koichi Shinohara did on the grave of Zhi and what happens after he dies, and all the miracles that were reported by his followers about that that are in the Guoqing Bailu, this great collection of letters, and that led to the founding and construction of the Guoqing Si. And so similar strategy of what's going on there. So I guess now just to move into a few questions here for Julia as well. And I think one of these you kind of hinted at, and it was one I wanted to start with. I think it's the obvious question. This was about, where we've all noticed, and there's been plenty of studies of this as well, that as Confucianism has marketed itself as, or has been marketed as a panacea for the wrongs of modern China, and some have attempted to sell it around the world as a kind of soft power through Confucius Institutes and other things, one does wonder why these streams of nationalism, cultural pride, and a new focus on Confucius, to say nothing of the deep desire to develop tourist sites, has not led to a more significant effort to rebuild the Kongzhai, say along the lines of the site in Gansu that Junjing has studied that did become a successfully revived site. So you end with some thoughts on this in the conclusion, but I would love to hear a little bit more reflection on what you think the possibilities for that return are, just because it's such an intriguing question. So I'm not sure if you want to take these kind of serially, or if I should, maybe that would be more interesting and people don't have to listen to me straight on, but we'll go for a little bit longer and then open it up. But I have a few more questions after this one. The reason I ask it is that we've learned from, the work of Bruno Latour on his, what he calls the iconoclash, that image destruction almost always leads to image production. That is to say, it's very difficult to destroy a memory. So in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and all the iconoclastic destruction that happens there was actually image production that came out, even images of Martin Luther, that were quite famous. And so, I was also thinking of, W.J.T. Mitchell once remarked that you can destroy a picture, but you can't destroy an image, in the sense that the image is very difficult to get out of one's mind. And I remember I studied with Bill Powell who wrote, very early reflection on his travel in China right after the Cultural Revolution, and tells a story about going to Chengdu, I believe it is. It goes into this destroyed Buddhist temple monastery, and the roof is caved in and there's nothing left in it, just rubble. But there's an old grandmother walking her children around, or the grandchildren around, describing to them what images would have been in what places and how to properly, acknowledge them. And there's a little bit of that in your conclusion when you show the picture of the flowers and things that are now popping up there. So anyway, if you could just say a few words about that, just initially, I'd just push you a little bit more on that. So I'll turn it to you, Julia.
Yeah, well, there have been efforts to rebuild, and I think it was partly in connection with compiling that 2009 massive genealogy. People were kind of rounded up and allowed to submit their proof of descent. And it seems like that was a moment when the local Kungs were re-energized, and they started, some of them started agitating to, if not fully rebuild it, at least make some kind of a commemorative structure that people could go to and so forth. And that actually got into, I forget what the exact name of the powerless government body is, but the local consultative commission actually put it forth as something to add to the 5-year plans a couple of different times, and it never got done. And I guess when I had a chance to talk to the director of the Qingpu Museum in 2016, I think what he told me was, well, if people wanted to rebuild it, they still wouldn't be allowed to do anything there. So it seemed like, well, why bother? But in the meantime, there has apparently been a community effort to at least compile documentation, and someone has created a set of new, very fanciful pictures. I've only seen screenshots of this. I haven't seen the actual publication, and even though it has an ISBN number, I have not been able to find it anywhere. but I know about it just kind of peripherally. So I think, efforts are still out there. Well, will they succeed? I don't know. It just seems to me that, I think, as I say in the book, one of the very few places that Kongjai is even mentioned in recent writing was in a 1987 article that the translation of the title is something to the effect of Kongjai is bogus. And I mean, everything about it, and I think I also point out that modern gazetteers, the 1990 Gazetteer of Qingpu is something like 700 pages long in Chinese, and they have about 2/3 of a page on the history of Kongzhai. So they recognize that it once existed. The 2009 edition does not even mention the name. So, I think there may be some seesaws back and forth of, what the political sentiment is about traces of so-called feudal beliefs. So things could change again. I mean, as I say, I was really quite surprised that finally this community group was able to publish a volume, even though it's not in any library or any bookstore.
Yeah.
Kind of a private history. But, it seems like things change.
Yeah. I mean, I think in your opening comments, you did allude to there's something in the nature of the way that the relics are there that may also be part of the problem here. And I was really glad, I think, those people, again, in Buddhist studies will be very, very familiar with some remarks that Gregory Chopin said long time ago about how scholars of religion are more comfortable with ideas than with things. And they're more comfortable with what they thought others thought than what they knew that they did. And so this, bringing the study, the study of relics in Buddhism and Christianity is pretty well developed and a prodigious amount of scholarship on that. But to have this study of Confucianism and relics in particular, I think is really welcome. But I also think that we can see here evident or a kind of an example of the problems of the way that the relics were treated, that or claimed or framed or whatever it is, that they're entirely hidden. And I think that this, we have some kind of similar examples, say in Japan, of statues that are called the hibutsu, right? The statues that are hidden away. But it's not that they're never shown or that they're completely hidden. In other words, those are shown very irregularly, or they're very obliquely and opened up occasionally. But the important thing is that it provides a glimpse. And in fact, it's the veiling of relics or the veiling of those images that really allows one or lends them a certain sense of plausibility that creates the kind of religious sense, I think, that these could possibly be there and possibly be there. And I think perhaps this notion that they have never been seen, they've never been represented. The ones in Chufu, we have, the altar that you show where they're shown on the images, even in the Difangzhi and all of that. So there seems to be something about this difference between visibility at Chufu, even Sima Qian writing about witnessing the relics there, versus the problem of hiddenness here, too much hiddenness. It loses the power of seductiveness that veiling does, or providing just a peek, just enough to make them plausible, I guess, is one way to put it. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that in some ways that gets to the tension between, the very strict Orthodox Confucian who believes that the veneration is to the great way, the spirit, the Tao, and not to the man, not to the human being. So that would, I think, militate against wanting to accord too much prestige to personal items that belong to that man, or were thought to belong to, or said to belong to. So I think that's one of the problems. And it seems that every so often in the sources, there's tangential reference to illicit shrines being added or illicit gods being moved in. And, it seems that there's always that feeling that something's being contaminated by expressions of popular religiosity.
Right. I mean, this is just such a classic kind of story. It's the exact same model that one sees in Christianity when you have representations of Christ, but then you also have the fears of the, the return of paganism and all of this.
Exactly.
But there were also hints in your book, I thought, of the very similar ways that the Christian tradition resolved this problem of representation, and particularly anthropomorphic representation that doesn't lend itself all the way to the to idolatry, as in a negative sense, in the fact that the way John of Damascus says, that basically the image is just something that's pointing beyond itself to the transcendent or some other. So it's not the materiality, and I think that there's ways that that we see in some of the Confucian material that maybe that kind of logic. I think there was even some expressions of that in the material that you wrote about, where it becomes an education, an inspiration, or a kind of spurring on for people to study hard, and you can see how it gets brought in that way. And the same thing in the Christian tradition, where they talked about images as being the Biblium Popularum, or something like that, the Bible for the populace, for those who can't read, where the images serve an educational function. So seems like there's ways they could play it, that some were trying to do that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it always intrigues me when I come across comments to the effect of, well, painting pictures of the life of Confucius, that's like putting feet on a snake, because the way exists in the teachings, and you don't need the the material manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it does seem to me significant that Confucianism, at least as we tend to think of it, was very much a male elite phenomenon. They didn't want, any women, and they didn't want the hoi polloi. So that's a bit different from Christianity. I mean, Christianity sort of welcomes everybody, doesn't it?
Okay. So I'm going to just ask one more, actually two small things, and we'll open it up for questions here. I really liked on your use of this very interesting discussion of the, I think it's around page 88 or something, where you speculate on this 1924 postcard. I love this, that had been mailed from Shanghai to England. I mean, the story is fabulous. And then as a depiction of the Kongzhai image that you speculate, and it sure seems plausible. But then you say in the discussion there that that images weren't consecrated, Confucian images were not consecrated. And I was just wondering, I mean, you cite Junjing's work throughout your study, which I think is great, a very interesting material. But in his book in the Temple of Memories, he reports on images of Confucius that are fashioned in North China following this custom, where he says where the statue had the anatomy of a person, and then in order to activate the deity's ability to respond to human supplications, they had rubies and pearls and other things that were put inside of them, and they had a spine. I think even in the destroyed images that you showed, you can see that on the inside of the Confucius image, and that people knew that these things were in there and pilfered them. And then we have Wang Liang's article. Then I think Thomas Wilson was signed on in that Sacred Grounds book, where he describes, the destruction of that Chufu image, and him punching in the belly of the old Kong and ripping out its guts because it had stuff in there. So if that's not consecration, or in other words, do you think that there were Confucian images that were consecrated? I mean, or how do you deal with those then?
Yeah, well, I would tend to think that would be an infiltration of ideas from other practices. I don't think it would have been there early on, but I can certainly imagine, and I know, the image that was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution in Chufu, it was created by palace artisans sent by the Yongzheng Emperor in 1730, and they put silver organs inside.
Yeah. But,
that just seemed totally novel. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, good. I think I think I'd love to open it up to our the audience that's here, because I know they'll have questions, and I want to make sure we have enough time here. And I see that Susan Huang has a question, or said she would like to be recognized. So Susan, good to see you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So Julia, I'm just so excited to see this book come out. I know how much you have invested in this. And in my previous work on Taoist visual culture and the current work on Buddhist print culture, I always find your study of Confucianism very inspiring. I'm wondering if I can direct our discussion to the visual culture and art history a little bit. And in particular, I was wondering if you could comment on, in your research on these visual materials you put together in this wonderful book, how do you see if there's any overlapping or similarity or differences compared to Buddhist print culture or Taoist print culture? And I ask this particularly because in the recent years, we see this abundant publications of Buddhist woodblock prints. There are more than 100 volumes published by Zhonghua Shudian, and this is in 2014 and 2017. And more recently, in 2019, there are 100 volumes of Taoist woodblock print, 道教版画全集. It's 100 volumes. So I was wondering, like in terms of Confucian material, how much do we have to work on, and how much does it compare to the Buddhist and Taoist counterparts? Can you elaborate any of these questions? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there's quite the volume that you're describing, but there certainly is a lot. I mean, as I mentioned at the outset, when I was working on pictorial biographies, there are loads and loads of different editions. And then, of course, reprints and recuts and slight modifications of any one edition, so there's lots of material, but I just don't think it's had the same importance to people as Buddhist and Taoist material has had. I think there's just sort of an inherent prejudice against this kind of thing. It's sort of, I remember a reaction of a senior scholar who was noted for working on Confucian philosophy, who said to me, that stuff's just mythology, So I think there's a different attitude toward the material, and maybe not as much preserved if it ever was there.
So in terms of image making, to create these Confucian materials, do you see any borrowing from?
Oh, yes.
So can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, I think I don't know if I go into it in this book, I can't remember, but I know on other occasions I've written about pictorial biography of Confucius kind of being in a way responding to the pictorial biography of the Buddha. And as a matter of fact, this great production in 1425 or something, the Da Baoan Si. The monk who oversaw that came from the hometown of the guy who compiled the first. I mean, I consider it the first, and we can go into discussions of why a lot of people want to think that the biography of Confucius was painted by Tang artists and Sung artists and Yuan artists. I don't think they did, but I think it originated in 1444 with this guy, Zhang Kai. And he was from the same hometown as this monk who was overseeing the Shijia Rulai Yinghua Shiji, the pictorial biography of Buddha and the beginning of the Buddhist church. So I think there's a direct connection.
That is very interesting. Vincent Gosset just published an article on the making of Taoist biography, and it also happened around 15th century. So I thought this 世事源流, the origin of the Buddha, this monumental compilation, may have some effect on the making of Confucian biography.
Yeah, I think so very much. I mean, not only was the Da Baoan Si associated with, it was the capital Nanjing very recently. It was still a secondary capital, I suppose, but also the Ming court republished it in the later part of the 15th century in a different, slightly different format, but it was very much out there. I think it was very influential.
Sure. Thank you.
And I would just urge people to look. I mean, this is on page 105, 106 of the volume of Julia's book. is where this is covered, and particularly the image on the top of page 106, which is the one from the Harvard Art Museums, which is the Kongzhai Shrine, which shows the birth of Confucius and the figures coming down from clouds and all of that. I mean, it's just it's a great image. So, okay, thank you, Susan. And we have Song Chen. Good to see you. Thanks. Now it's your turn.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So this is Song Chen at Bucknell University. I'm a social historian of Middle Imperial China. So let me ask a question from the perspective of social history. Now, I haven't read the book, so this may be addressed in the book. To what extent do we have evidence that this Kongjai may or may not have been used as the ancestral worship shrine of the local Kong lineage during the Ming and Qing period? And to what extent do we see evidence of other non-Kong people from the locality also paying worship at Kongjai during the late imperial period? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I go into that in some detail. There was allegedly a line of Kungs at Kongjai until the middle of the Tang Dynasty, but then there is absolutely no record of any Kungs whatsoever until the middle of the 17th, after the place has been developed as a shrine. So I think it begins as a scholars project, very much, and then they want to make it more. They try many different strategies to make it more well-known and important and prestigious. So they get in touch with the Duke of the Kungs in Chufu. At that point, it's the 67th generation Duke, Kung Yu Chi. And I think once they establish that connection, then Kungs begin to take an interest, and there are lots of branches of Kungs in the general area. And one of them shows up in 1647 and demands to be made the chief sacrificer, because he said, this is, my family, basically. But it takes another several decades before something is officially established, and there is a line of hereditary Kung sacrificers that is established in about, 1738 or something. And I think that at the point when Kungs kind of take over, it becomes less appealing to just your average scholar, literatus student, because it's kind of like a family thing now. It's not. The scholars thought they were the heirs of Confucius, maybe not blood heirs, but certainly spiritual, intellectual, philosophical, ethical, whatever. They saw themselves as legitimately the heirs of Confucius. And I think there was definitely a conflict there.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Song Chen. That's a great question. I mean, Jill, what I thought was fascinating in that section where you're discussing them is that you also have these Kongs that become kind of squatters in the Kongjai, and then they're kind of lower class and just, I guess, seem to be, sort of hanging out there and doing stuff. But then you also have this, what I found really fascinating is that the place keeps getting kind of drawn back down or back into kind of popular religion, these interesting kind of notations of various gods then being worshipped and things like that. So anyway, it's just another side of it that's fascinating for that kind of more social history of the locale.
Yeah, I do go into what I consider to be social history issues quite a bit, and I didn't really say much about that today, but I do think that, Kongjai was a platform to try to bid for prestige for various different groups at various different times. Yeah. And James, as you said, it is sort of a failed site in some respects, but it succeeded for a while at different points.
Yeah, and it helped certain locals, right? I mean, it really did prop some people up, so yeah.
Yeah.
So we have there's a question in the chat by Mani, and I'll go ahead and read it. And it was actually something I was going to comment on myself, but I withheld just in the interest of time. But basically, the question is, how are you going to translate the Aura of Confucius in the title of the book into Chinese? And I was going to be asking, how did you choose this word aura to be so prominent in the title? What were you kind of getting at? I mean, obviously it brings up the work of Walter Benjamin and the, loss of aura in Age of Mechanical Production and all of that, perhaps. But perhaps we need a different sense of losing aura here as well.
But yeah, I know it's more poetic than anything else.
Well, fair enough.
I really wanted to call it Aura of the Sage, but the publisher said, nope, you need a keyword in the title. So could not have that. I wasn't thinking so much in the Walter Benjamin sense of aura, so much as just sort of like a ling qi, an auspicious kind of spirit, or, just more of a Chinese kind of aura, not a Walter Benjamin aura.
Yeah. So Mani suggested, should it be Kongzhai Shengji, or I mean, it sounds like you're almost more like Ling than anything else, but it'll be, yeah. I'm glad I'm not solving
that. Well, I think that the Kongzhai Emperor came up with a pretty good formulation in his 4-character epithet. So maybe that should be it.
That would be interesting, to be sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we'll cross that bridge later.
Yeah. Borrow the words of the Kongzhai Emperor. Good. Let's see. Do we have? Oh, hey, Thomas. Good to see you, Thomas Wilson, of course. The floor is yours.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi. How are you?
Oh, you had so much to do with the whole trajectory of this project.
Well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you on completion of this book. I know this is something that you've been working on for quite some time.
Quite some time.
Yes, and I don't have the book yet, so I'm asking a question that actually comes back. Oh, and thank you, James. I think that your comments were really really terrific, and I think very provocative. But I want to go back to this question of relic. And my own sense is that there's a broader range of senses and cultic uses of temple spaces in Confucianism. I think that there are some people like Liu Zongzhou in the 17th century who argued that that this is the temple is to venerate the Tao, not the man. But I think that there are plenty patrons who actually had a much sort of had much greater resonance with the cultic figure of Confucius, which is really one of the reasons why I'm interested in your treatment of relics. The cap and cape and so on, and how it. In the book, do you actually address the question of how these relics were used in Kungjai, or might or should have been used? I mean, how far do you take your analysis of relics?
Well, I don't think I go terribly far. I draw on, I would say, what I've read about Buddhist relics to kind of set it up. And I think the important difference is, as James was just saying before, I mean, these are not things that were ever seen. So the sort of surrogate presence is created by building this above ground tomb mound and putting a stele on top and a pavilion on top of that, and marking it in the landscape. So kind of saying, they're there, but I think because Sima Qian was so eloquent in expressing how he was moved by seeing, these things actually touch the body of Confucius, kind of, the chariot, the zither, the cap, the robe, when he went to the temple, centuries after Confucius' death. I think something about that must be in the back of people's minds. They learned the Shiji after all.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and the big difference here, right, is it's not necessarily an exclusive one, though, too, of corporeal relics versus contact relics. And you find both in the Buddhist tradition, obviously, but there is something really interesting about clothing. And, Yunmi, you probably know, has written this really interesting piece on clothing on robes put inside of Korean statues, of Buddhist statues. And yeah, something, you know, about that, when many of them are, and the interesting thing is they're soiled, you know, they either have some kind of staining on them as well, so it even gives it more of a sense of a kind of a literally a contact relic, you know, with sweat stains or whatever it is, you know, that's on there. But
yeah, well, I guess the so-called 3 categories of relic: the contact relic, the teaching relic, and the body relic. I mean, the contact relic and the teaching relic seem very useful for Confucians, but you know, we make a distinction with the body relic because you're supposed to keep your body intact, so you certainly don't want to have body relics.
great. Any follow-up, Thomas? Are you good? Good to see you. Thanks for.
Thank you.
All right. We have another. I think we still have some time here, so we have a question in the Q&A from Calvin Lin, who says he thinks this question might be addressed in the book, but what were the attitudes that the Ming and Qing state governments held to the relics at the Kongzhai and the cult of Confucius more generally? And on a related note, would you consider these practices to be in any way defying Confucius?
Well, it seems that once there was a shrine built in the 17th century, and it got, you know, sort of knocked down and rebuilt a few times, but it seems that the local officials, when they reported to their office, were approached by local literati and told that there's this place you have to go, you know, sacrifice to, you know, pretty early on in your term here. And some of them, I think, really thought it was a seriously good thing, and others are like, okay, if you insist, you know. And as far as the attitude of the Qing, I mean, the Gazetteer of Kungjai was submitted to the Sukutran Shu to be copied into that, you know, massive project, but it was rejected. Mm-hmm. Because as the sort of Kaozheng or the evidential scholarly position was, well, it makes no sense whatsoever that the clothing could have lasted that long, that a descendant could have had it, that it could have been buried there. And, you know, this is all totally, you know, ridiculous. So I think that, you know, there wasn't a single consistent point of view on the relics, but there were certainly some people who came as officials, and even, you know, education intendants who were pretty high ranking, who took it seriously. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, the whiplash that must have been felt by that site between what happens with the Kangxi Emperor, and then when you get to Yongzheng and Qianlong, it's just complete about face and a rejection of the entire site. It seemed like it must have been, you had this optimism, you know. It's kind of funny, the tale. I mean, the story that you tell of them lobbying for the Kangxi Emperor's calligraphy is just incredibly fascinating. It's amazing that it's in such detail too. So it reminds you, it's like, say after a concert or something like that, you know, autograph seekers, you have these, you know, these people meeting him at when he is at a stop, and then they're just clamoring to present their ideas and all of this. Anyway, it's just a really incredible account, and you have that kind of an optimism that, wow, we've got this now, we've got a placard, which usually was very meaningful to have that, and then it's taken away and totally delegitimated, and then in the Gazetteers they don't even mention it, or they repudiate it, and then it's sitting in a pile of hay, as you showed in the picture. So yeah, well, I also relating to that, I mean, the diction of the Gazetteer of Kungjai, the sort of long preface section that talks about the Kangxi Emperor and the interactions, that they really get into sort of vernacular language, and I found it really fascinating. You know, they claim that the Kangxi Emperor was, you know, just talking to them like regular folks, like, oh, you're so far from home, you better get going, you know, yeah, that kind of stuff. Also, it took me a long time to realize this, but the reason why the Kangxi Emperor was so close by was because he was on his way to Sungjiang from Suzhou. And there, you know, the river goes right by. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you have they saw their chance and they took it. Yeah, and then when he returns, I loved it. You know, he looks out the window and he he quips to somebody, "Oh, there are those Qingpu people again." You know, it's just like, it's so human, you know. It's just, I mean, to have the emperor saying that, it was just very. I found it quite humorous, which was.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. I was afraid at first that was just all made up, but I found that, you know, official sources do refer much more succinctly to this encounter. But so it really did happen.
Yeah, great. Let's see, I don't, is there any other questions from the audience where we have a few minutes that we could squeeze in, probably one more, if anybody had anything they'd like to ask or to comment. Either use, you know, the raise hand function, or you can type it quickly into the Q&A. I'll give you maybe a second longer. And if not, let's see, we'll wait one more second. Oh, here we go. Mark Halpern. Okay, we knew Mark would come through here with something. He says, so why did the contemporary political authorities save the trees?
I've often wondered about that. That happens a lot of different places. A lot of places. And it seems like ginkgo trees are particularly seriously considered. I mean, yeah, I don't really know, but I guess I do sort of bring up what other people have said, which is trees are sort of surrogates for people, you know, especially scholars. You know, it takes a long time to develop. So it's sort of a self-cultivation involved there. But yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's so many temple sites that I've been to over the years where, you know, everything's been remade since the Cultural Revolution, but the trees are really old.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you do find in some monastic records, and but you know, that probably is not applicable here, but you know, the prohibitions against the felling of trees on within the domain, and this was a Buddhist monastery initially as well, right? I mean, that I found
right
that
next door. I mean,
right
that's
next
the
door.
other aspect that I didn't bring up today, but the sort of jockeying back and forth for control of the territory from Kongzhai and the Buddhist monastery there.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to ask you more about that, but I think, you know, most people were signing in to listen to the Confucian side of things. So, but I was fascinated by that, and to see if there were other records that might be available for that Huiwer, what did they call it? A Huiwer Jiao.
Huiwer Jiao. Yeah, changed the names a couple of times.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it gave the name to the Neolithic archaeological site. You know, it's called Siqian, so in front of the monastery.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, that was the site that Huang Xuanpei excavated. So it was just my lucky break that I knew him.
Yeah. And there was one comment I was going to make on that, since we're on it, which is, I think that the Jiao Si that it's referring there to is actually falling into that threefold categorization of Chan, Jiao, and Lu. So it's actually referring to teaching monasteries rather than these are inherited. You know, whether it's a hereditary line that's passed through, that has to be Chan lineage monks for the Chan ones, and the Jiao ones were for doctrine and study, and then Lu for precepts. So so the fact that it's a Jiao Si connected to the Confucian side is actually makes, you know, probably good sense for why that was stayed around. Anyway, it's just a small point, but interesting. So I think my final comment is just to say, you know, that first of all, congratulations, Julia. Thank you for all the work you put into this book. I learned a tremendous amount from it. I got totally gripped in reading it. Who knew that what I think it's 3 linked chapters on the Gazetteers, and they were just absolutely fascinating. I mean, I thought, okay, here we go. It's going to get into the nitty gritty of Gazetteers, and you told the story just in a really wonderful way, and it was a really persuasive account of those. And I think in the end, you know, here we have this site, as I said in my opening comments, that it kind of serves as a reliquary itself for the relics that are claimed to be there. But I also wonder if we have a different sense of the reliquary and its kind of root meaning, which goes back to remains, with literally the translation of that term, or something that decays in place, something that's relinquished or left behind. And sadly, that's kind of what we have in the end of the day with the Kongzhai, is this site that you show from the satellite images that's really shrinking and nothing left but those trees. So But you brought it back to life. You filled it again, and we have you to thank for that. So you should have the last word, Julia. So we'll turn it back to you for your final comment, and then I think Yuhong can bring it to a close. But thanks again.
Well, I'm very grateful for everybody's attention, and thank you for all the questions. And I have to say, it did take me a long time. You know, I say in my acknowledgements, begin the acknowledgements by saying I discovered that I actually had stumbled across the topic of the life of Confucius even before I remembered having done so. So in the mid-70s, you know, so this is really life work. So I'm delighted I lived long enough to finish. Anyway, so thank you, everybody.
Okay, congratulations to Julia again for this beautiful book. We are also very grateful for Professor Robson's very insightful, rich comments on this book and also relevant subjects. We also want to thank every participants and also for your wonderful questions. So everyone have a great weekend. Yeah, thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Yuhong. Bye, Julia.
Bye.